Good morning. I'm Amanda Aaron, President of the Metro New York chapter of the Appraisal Institute. Welcome to day 2 of our virtual fall conference, New York City Post-COVID Impact on Multifamily and Development. This morning's half of the conference will run from now until 11:30 a.m., and we have a lineup of speakers and panelists for you today addressing land and development, the multifamily market and rent regulation, and the lending and investment landscape. Let's have the next slide. As always, we would like to thank the sponsors of our chapter who make programs and events like this possible. Most of you were here yesterday and know the drill with the technology, but if you have any tech issues at all, we have a special email, fallconferencehelp@gmail.com. If you have trouble entering your name into the attendance, you may send it to that email when attendance is called. And the phone number on this page, join by phone under audio issues, you can always use that if you have trouble with audio. Or you can enlarge the control panel with that orange arrow that most of you have, switch to no audio and back to computer audio. Okay, next slide. So today's portion of the fall conference is approved for 2.5 hours of continuing ed from the state of New York. We're applying to the state of New Jersey. And there are strict rules regarding attendance and technology for virtual conferences. So if you are going for continuing ed credit, Connie needs to have a copy of your driver's license with your personal private information redacted. And you need to be on this conference through your personal email link on some kind of a device that's tracking your attendance. You must stay on the webinar for the entire time until 11:30 in order to receive credit and not be working in other windows because the software tracks your attention. So next slide. We'll be taking attendance twice during this conference. We're going to do the first attendance check right now. So please locate the questions box on your control panel. You can get to the control panel on most devices with the orange arrow and press the triangle next to questions and enter your name into the questions box. And if you have trouble doing this, send your name by email to fallconferencehelp@gmail.com. You may also, throughout this program, submit, and we encourage you to submit questions in that same questions box for speakers and panelists at any time. We have a full program today, but Bobby Porto from the Appraisal chapter will be monitoring your questions and will address a small sample of questions with each speaker during the program. Great. Just want to make sure everybody's getting their names in there. Looks like quite a few of you are. Okay, so we're ready to start. So let's go to the next slide. Our opening segment today will be a discussion on the land and development market between Mark Knackel and Bob Knackel. Mark Knackel is Executive Director within the Valuation and Advisory Group of Cushman & Wakefield, where he has been since 2006. Mark is immediate past president of the Metro New York chapter of the Appraisal Institute and maintains an active appraisal practice, specializing in litigation and arbitration work. Bob Knackel needs no introduction to this group, but I will turn it over to Mark for that part. Mark.
Good morning, everyone. Hello, and welcome to day 2 of the conference. Before I get started, I wanted to personally acknowledge and thank Amanda Aaron and Connie Puccio for the tremendous work they've done to navigate our chapter through 2020 thus far. Running the chapter during a typical year is never easy, and adding in COVID-19 magnifies the challenges by multiples. I'm proud that our chapter has figured out ways to offer classes, seminars, and conferences to keep us in the know and to help for us to continue to get continuing ed credits. So Amanda and Connie, I believe I speak on behalf of most, if not everyone on this call. A big thank you and a job well done from all of us. With all that said, I am now honored to be introducing Bob Knackel, Chairman of New York Investment Sales and Capital Markets at JLL. A little introduction and brief bio. Bob started his real estate career in 1984 at CB Richard Ellis, where he met Paul Massey Jr. They both left CB in 1988 to form Massey Knackel. From 1998 through 2014, Massey Knackel closed over 6,000 transactions with an aggregate value in excess of $23 billion. One of the things I personally remember most about Massey Knackel, Bob, I don't know if you remember this, was masseyknackel.com/appraisals, which was a page specifically tailored to appraisers to answer the questions that we would be calling you and asking, and you guys had the foresight to just put it all in one sheet for us quarterly. You and Paul always set a great example to your employees by talking with us in the appraisal community, so thank you. In 2014, Cushman & Wakefield acquired Massey Knackel, to my delight personally. In 2014, 15, and 16, Bob was ranked the top originating sales broker at Cushman & Wakefield globally. In September 2018, Bob joined JLL. To date, Bob has personally been responsible for the sale of over 2,000 buildings and over $18 billion in sales. Since 2009, Bob has written a weekly column on the New York City real estate market called Concrete Thoughts for the Commercial Observer. So with that, Bob, good morning. Thank you for your continued support of our group. And hello, how are you?
Hey, Mark, how you doing? Pleasure to be here today. It always is a favorite of mine to speak to the appraisal community. You guys are wonderful, and yes, I do fondly remember the old sales data for appraisers only mailings that we used to send to you guys. But wanted to thank Amanda and Connie for having me as a speaker, and you know, again, it makes me feel great to come and share some insights with my friends in the appraisal community. So good morning, everybody.
Wonderful. So let's just start right with the question on everybody's mind here. Appraisers are data and comp junkies. That's all we want to know about. So with respect to the land market, are there any transactions, contracts, deals that we should be aware of and that will be telling of pricing today?
The short answer is yes, but the longer answer needs to be explored, because I think what we've seen, we kind of view the pre-COVID and post-COVID world as starting and ending on March 12th. That was kind of the date when everybody was sent home. Any transactions that close after March 12th, it's very important to understand when the contract was signed, because my argument is that any contract that was signed pre-March 12th that closed subsequently is not really an arm's length transaction that's indicative of the post-COVID environment. I think that we are looking for and have seen only very, very few land transactions where the transaction is closed and the contract after March 12th. So what we're doing, and this is really from an appraiser's point of view, because you know, you're looking at data on actual closings, but when we're doing broker opinion of values for clients today, we're really relying much more on transactions that are under contract, transactions where contracts are being negotiated, and what our bidding activity is on the properties that we have out on the market. And it really has been changing almost week to week. And it's only by having a lot of activity on properties we have on the market that we're trying to get a sense of what values are today. But I don't envy you guys trying to do a formal appraisal today based on tangible comp data because there's just not a lot of it.
Well, it sounds like you're going to need to make us a website with all the details of the contracts and negotiations you have to help us with our issues. So what are the profiles of the buyers and the sellers that are in the market today? Are the sellers in distress? Are the buyers just bottom feeders? Are they, who are they and what are they looking for?
Right. Well, I think to answer that question, I'd like to just back up and give a little perspective, because probably the number one, and then two very different groups, the buyers and the sellers, but the number one question everybody is asking today is, should I sell today? Should I wait 6 months? Should I wait 12 months? And I think that the correction that we're in now actually started in the beginning of the fourth quarter of 2015. The bull market, where we had more buildings sell in 2014 than ever before by more than 10%. We had a higher dollar volume than ever before in 2015. Really changed very dramatically and tangibly in October of 15. That's when I think the old market ended and the correction phase started. And basically for 4.5 years almost, we were in an investment sales market correction that was mostly a volume correction rather than a value correction. Volume had dropped by about 70% slowly, starting in 16 and continuing through February of this year. While we had that very significant drop in volume, values only fell by about 10% on average. So if you compare that diminution in value to the 38% drop we saw during the Great Recession and the 58% drop we saw during the S&L crisis, it was a relatively benign correction from a value perspective. But what we saw, when clients are asking, well, what should we do now? We view COVID, the onset of COVID, as starting the value correcting phase within this correction. So up until February, it really was a volume correction. Now it's a value correction. And to answer the question of what folks should do moving forward, nobody has a crystal ball. So we looked at past corrections and saw that during the Great Recession, it took more than 3 years for values to bottom out. During the S&L crisis, it took more than 4 years for values to bottom out. And during the Great Recession, it was more than 7 years before values got back to their previous peak. So the 2007 values were not attained again until 2014. And during the S&L crisis, the 1988 values didn't come back until 1998, a 10-year gap. So what we're advising clients is that if you want to sell within the next few years, probably better to sell now. And this sounds very, very self-serving as a broker. Yeah, sell now, sell now. But the fact is that if you look at previous corrections, if this correction plays out the way the previous two big ones did, it will be better to sell today than to wait a year or two, because it's very likely, if we use history as our guide, very likely that values won't bottom out until sometime in late 22 or 23. Now, some folks have argued that well, if we get an effective therapeutic or a vaccine, that will change things significantly. It will change things for the health crisis, but on top of that, we have real estate fundamentals that are in stress. We have political headwinds. We have fiscal headwinds in the city. So there are a lot of issues. It's not just a health issue that we have. And so the likelihood that this unfolds like those previous corrections did is much more likely than it's for a shorter period of time.
Bob, you mentioned the political aspect, and without asking political opinions, how do you see the current political climate impacting values, short-term, long-term, and how could real estate be seen as part of a solution to the social problems that I believe everybody acknowledges needs to be addressed, but real estate's gotten a bad rap. So how do we navigate that going forward as an industry?
Yeah, that's a great question, Mark. And I never make any political statements. I'm not a Republican. I'm not a Democrat. I'm a real estatarian. So I look at things from the perspective of real estate. And, when you see things happening like what happened at the Kingsbridge Armory or Annabelle Basin or Industry City recently, you wonder why folks wouldn't want more jobs to be created. And not only those direct jobs, but the ancillary jobs that will be created to support those primary jobs, and the tax revenue that is associated with all of those jobs. I mean, depending on what report you read, the city has between a $7 and a $10 billion budget gap this year. That creates all types of policy issues. With rents dropping, clearly there's downward pressure being exerted on rents across the board. Theoretically, real estate taxes should be going down because of that, but the city is going to be very reluctant to give relief there simply because of the need for revenue. And then you look at what's happened in the multifamily sector, which really has gotten now a double hit. The rent laws changing in June of 2019 was kind of the first gut punch, and COVID is a second. But these are things that do impact real estate very fundamentally. If historically cap rates on multifamily assets were always the lowest because of the embedded upside in those properties, and today extracting that upside is much more difficult, cap rates have to rise. So policy does impact how real estate performs. And if you look at tax policy, for instance, tax policy has an unbelievably profound impact on our real estate market. If you look at, and I always go back to 1984, which is when I started in the business, but if you go back to 84 and look at the top 5 years in terms of the number of buildings sold in the city, 3 of them were catalyzed by tax policy changes. 1986, where we had tax reform of 86, created an urgency for people to act. We had in 1998, capital gains taxes were reduced from 28% to 20%. That created a huge spike. And again, in 2012, we had a mass sell-off because of the 3.8% capital gains tax that was kind of covertly hidden in the healthcare bill. Also leading up to the elections that year, there was a lot of talk about raising capital gains taxes. So market participants in real estate are highly reactive to changes in tax policy. So getting back to, and we're kind of far away from the question you asked, but I want to get back to who are the buyers and who are the sellers today. The sellers today are a combination of folks who don't have a choice, and they are also people who are desirous of selling and want to take advantage of the fact that, yes, selling today is probably going to be better for them. They'll get a better result than if they wait a year or two, and they're not in a position to wait 5 or 6 or 7 years until values come back. So I think that if you look at what's happening in the market today, there are some interesting motivations that are catalyzing people to sell. On the buy side, there are folks who believe in the city long term. They believe that the market's going to be very different 3 or 4 years from today, when what they're buying in order to build a new building will come online. And so that's the one great thing about New York, is there are so many people here that even if a significant slice of the market decides it's time to get out of New York and buy elsewhere, there's still a heck of a lot of people left who believe in the city, that want to buy and believe that the city cycles, and that even our politics comes and goes in waves, and that at some point our political headwinds will be less anti-business, less anti-real estate, and will swing back, and they want to be there in a good position when that happens.
Agreed. Yesterday we had Jonathan Resnick from Resnick and Sons and Tom Bow from Durst. And so when you think of families like that have been around for generations and have survived multiple economies and social issues and whatnot, when you have that long term, you know, somebody like that or a new families looking like that could be the buyers. So how have the economics of land development changed? I mean, what's feasible to build? You know, it always used to be condos where definitely if you had a residential site, condos were far and above the highest and best use. Is that still the case? Is it now rental? Is rental feasible? And then what about office? So just kind of talking about feasibility on land and what would you build?
Right. Well, that's a great question, and I think today, if you look at the economics of development, you know, there are several different components that you look at, and one of the major variables that we track is how construction prices are trending. And if you look at that market, the expectation is that that construction costs will come down. I think that's happening, but it's happening very slowly. You know, one of the things that I did during the pandemic is I would come into town every 7 to 10 days and drive around, walk around looking at sites under construction. And south of 110th Street on the west side and 96th Street on the east side, just in Manhattan, there are 649 properties under construction, which is a massive amount. I never imagined that it could be that many, but it is. I've looked at each one of them. Wow. And so the folks who build buildings are very, very busy, and the contractors are busy. So with all of that going on, you know, it's not surprising that construction costs are not coming down rapidly. With respect to what's feasible to build, that really depends on how you view the end user market. And clearly, there has been a very significant shift away from condo development. Not that it's not going on at all. We're doing a couple of transactions now that will be for condo development, but they're very unique circumstances. I rather not go into those unique circumstances at the moment, but overwhelmingly, residential developers are looking to do residential development. Then the question becomes, what is the rent that you're going to project? And getting a handle on what rents are today is a challenge as well. A lot of landlords in free market buildings are offering 2 and 3 months of free rent on a 12-month lease. So are you looking at face rents? Are you looking at net effective rents? What happens when that lease expires? What's the market going to be like 3 years from today when what you're buying is you're going to build it and it'll come online? What's the market going to be like then? Office construction, another very interesting thing. I think you know, one of the most opaque markets we have right now is the office sector. I think that things are happening very rapidly in retail, in hotels, in residential, mainly because of the very profound impact COVID has had on the retail sector. But the shortness of leases, you know, hotels have 1-day leases, multifamily has 1 or 2 year leases. They're reacting much more quickly, whereas in office, I think that the dynamics within the office sector play out over a much longer period of time because lease expiration is going to dictate a lot of what companies do, and how is the working from home dynamic going to impact office utilization moving forward. Some companies may be having very good experiences working from home. Some companies may be having poor experiences working from home. What's the impact on corporate culture? So many different things are going to impact the decisions that are made in the office sector. But what we are seeing, and from what our leasing folks are telling me, is that new office buildings are still commanding very, very high rents. So I think there really is a differentiation between new office stock and the traditional pre-war or older office stock in the city. And each of those is probably going to perform a little differently.
Case in point, One Vanderbilt sitting right behind you. So is acquisition and construction financing available? And has, you know, with interest rates down, are the spreads up? Are there tougher covenants and requirements of the borrowers, or what's the debt market and how's that impacting land?
Yeah, the debt market is still robust. There's a lot of capital available. Spreads have increased, which makes it a little more profitable for lenders to lend. And you know, our debt platform here is very, very robust. We're doing land acquisition loans, we're doing construction loans, and they're certainly more challenging to get done today, but the capital is available and people are getting them done.
Interesting. Are there different types of lenders coming into the market too, or is it the usual suspects that we saw pre-corona?
No, I think it's a combination. From what we've seen, the senior lenders are fairly consistent with what the makeup of that arena is. We've seen some new folks getting into the mezz lending space, which is good. It's always good when you get new people coming into the market because they have a fresh outlook and perspective on things. And so we've seen some good activity on the debt side.
And what about the boroughs compared to Manhattan? You know, I live in Bay Ridge, Brooklyn, and the activity there has been great. Houses are flying off the market, and there's new development, and I see other outer borough neighborhoods busy with the restaurants. Is it different story there, or how does that play out?
Yeah, without a doubt, Manhattan is getting hit much harder than the outer boroughs. I think there is still some downward pressure on fundamentals in the outer boroughs, but I think that the folks in Manhattan generally are a little more mobile, and so we've seen the big vacancies that we've seen in the housing market here in Manhattan has been creating a great dynamic in the tri-state area. If you talk to residential brokers in New Jersey, Westchester, Connecticut, Long Island, the housing market is very, very firm. Prices are going up. It's tough to find properties to buy. And I think that in the same way that the tri-state area has been a beneficiary of folks leaving Manhattan, so have the outer boroughs. For the same money, you can get a lot more space, maybe better access to outdoor space, maybe bigger space within your apartment. And if you're working from home, nicer to have an extra bedroom or something like that you could use. So I think that the dynamics in the outer boroughs are still receiving some negativity based on what's going on citywide, but not nearly to the extent that we're seeing in Manhattan.
Interesting. Funny, I had a question of what are the bright spots in terms of location and pricing, and it sounds like residential suburban is your answer, because that's where the market's headed. And one of the questions we're asking everybody, which of the impacts of the COVID pandemic will lead to structural change in the land market versus a temporary value decline? You said normally takes about 3 years to come back, but we don't just have an economic issue, we have a health issue, we have some social issues, we have political issues. There's a lot. So what do you think, you know, looking forward in your crystal ball, what's really a structural change and what's a short-term blip in a generational history timeline?
Yeah, it's hard to say. It's hard to say what type of inertia all of these dynamics are going to have and whether they're short term or long term. I know that for the land market, you know, we need a tax abatement program. And that's another thing we have looming is the expiration of the new Affordable New York tax abatement program. Very important that our elected officials get on board and renew that before it expires. You know, when 421A expired, we had a gap between when it expired and when the new Affordable New York kicked in. That is not an optimal circumstance for the development community. So I think that, you know, abatement programs are very, very important. I think that there also should be a way. One of the great things the city did after 9/11 was the creation of the 421G tax abatement program to create incentives to convert office properties to residential downtown. I think in the same way, a lot of our office stock today is functionally obsolete relative to the utility that you get out of new constructed office space. So maybe one of the many solutions to the affordable housing program would be to create a tax abatement program to convert obsolete office buildings into affordable housing. There are a number of things that that can be done to help the affordable housing problem in the city. And how each of these things is going to impact the dynamics of how the land market operates moving forward, will have an impact. But we need to see how things are going to play out with migration trends, with the use of space moving forward, as the market cycles and things shift, different uses become a more higher and effective use of space. You look at some buildings. I know, I sold a building on East 44th Street many years ago, which was originally built as an apartment building, and in the 50s, the late 50s, early 60s, it was converted to office. And when we sold it, it was converted to a hotel. And today, that building may be converted back to its original use of an apartment building. So, these things always cycle based upon what the highest and best use is at that particular time. And a lot of that highest and best use could be determined based not only on real estate fundamentals, but also what type of policy is enacted to motivate the private sector.
Interesting. Bob, this has been great. I'm going to leave you with one quick question, and then I'm going to turn it over to Bobby Porto to go through the Q&A from the group. Any TV, movie, podcast, or reading suggestions for the group that you've been enjoying and you'd like to share?
Oh gosh, one of the things I learned from one of my mentors, Steve Siegel, was to be a voracious reader. And I love reading books on psychology, on selling, on persuasion. Some of the great ones, Bob Cialdini is the head of the psych department at University of Arizona, probably the leading authority on persuasion in the United States. He wrote some great books on persuasion. From my alma mater, the Wharton School, Richard Schell has a great book called The Art of Woo. Good to Great by Jim Collins, Never Read Alone, Keith Ferrazzi, The Power of a Positive No by Bill Urey, the Harvard professor. There are so many great books out there that I think you can get so much out of, because so much of our business is psychological and based on tendencies that people have and things like that. So I love reading stuff like that. And for anyone out there who's interested, shoot me an email. I have a great reading list that I'd be happy to share with you.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much. Bobby, I'm going to turn it over to you. Bob, as always, good talking to you.
Mark, great seeing you. Tell everybody back at the shop I say hello.
I will. See ya.
Good morning, Bob. How you doing?
Hey, Bobby. How you doing this morning?
All right. Thank you for taking the time to speak with us. As you can imagine, there are a lot of questions. I'll try to paraphrase and group a couple of them together. We have about 10 minutes to go through a number of them. Many of the questions are related to the fact that you mentioned that you have some contracts that are maybe in the works. Can you give us a little bit of detail, high level, any impact to pricing from where you had originally listed or thought the values may come in, and where the locations are and how pricing is impacted in each location?
Yeah, I have to be careful about how I couch this. Well, let's just say that from a land value perspective, based on the dynamics of going from a condo-centric development market to a rental-centric development market, I think that value the value differentiator between those two is probably 50%. And if you look at sites that we sold 2 years ago in the neighborhoods where we're doing these deals today, there's about a 40 to 50% drop in value. And that is in Manhattan centric. Now, there are other sites, I'll say it's also very, very dependent on the size of the property and the location of the property. I think the diminution in value has been a lot less for smaller sites that are very well located, and boutique condo construction might still be feasible from a developer's perspective. And then you look at some of the sites we're selling in the outer boroughs, the diminution in value has been much less. So I think it's very, very hard to generalize. You can't say land values are down X or Y. It really is so site specific, and what that property is going to be used for, how much equity is required, what's the risk profile. People might be willing to build 30 condos today, but not 300. So it's so very, very specific. It's dangerous to give any specificity with regard to what the change in values have been. It's really, really site specific. If anybody has any questions about a specific site, I'm happy to share a little bit more granular or insightful feedback. But I think it's dangerous to say land is down X, Y, or Z. I think if you look at comps, for instance, look at what has traded so far in 2020, you would say there's no reduction in land value, because mixed in with the sites that have sold, some of those were under contract prior to March 12th. Some of them were last pieces of assemblages that were done at very, very high numbers. Understandably so. So the data, our data actually shows land values up in 2020 by 1%. Now that I don't believe is indicative of what's happening with land values, but it is so site specific, you really have to look at each site individually.
Gotcha. Okay. Understood, Bob. You touched on the impact of rent regulation. We have a number of questions about rent regulation, some in regards to development sites and some in regards to just rent regulated multifamily product. The question about development sites is, do you see there being a scarcity of development sites, given that the assemblages are a bit more difficult with rent regulation now in place and rent stabilized units unable to be vacated permanently? And then do you see the correction of the rent regulated product, the multifamily product, being more permanent until or if the law is changed in some way?
Okay, first question about our development sites getting scarce. Again, this was such an insightful exercise I did of driving and walking every street in Manhattan. In addition to the 649 properties that are under construction in the city, we identified 672 sites that are of at least 5,000 square feet of land that are owned by a single owner, that are developed to less than 25% of its maximum buildable ZFA. That's a lot. And in addition to that, we also identified assemblage opportunities. I haven't even counted those up yet, but there are probably a couple of thousand of those. So I think there still is a lot of potential for development in Manhattan, and I believe that to the extent fundamentals warrant buying land, folks will continue to buy and continue to develop. And I'm sorry, Bobby, the second part of your question about rent regulation, what was the specific question?
The question is, do you see the correction that has occurred to rent regulated product being permanent, or, so long as the law remains unchanged?
Well, I think that depends on what the balance of power becomes and what the fiscal realities of everything become. I think that there are a bunch of folks in Albany who believe that universal rent control will kick in sometime in this session. There are other people that believe that it won't. To the extent that the political leanings in Albany remain consistent, it's very likely that the current system of rent regulation that we have will stay in place. To the extent that there's a shift, maybe it does change. And there are people who are buying today that believe that, maybe it's not 5 years from now, but 10 years or 20 years from now, there will be a big shift politically, either out of necessity or otherwise, that will change the rent regulation horizon, and it will become more free market. That's a difficult question to answer, but it seems pretty transparent that it's going very hard in one way, and I think that is what is encouraging a lot of folks who have for decades only purchased multifamily properties in New York to be buying around the country.
Okay. Another question is, do you see buyers or developers modeling for rent increases after a vaccine for COVID-19 is achieved in, a year or two down the road in their model?
I haven't seen any, I haven't had that specific conversation with any developers saying, this is our post-vaccine increase in rent is going to be X, Y, or Z. I think that there are a group of folks who believe that this is a short-term issue and that folks will come back to the city. And while we've had, if you look at a 2 or 3 month free rent period on a 12-month lease, that's an 18 to 25% drop in rent. So what happens at the expiration of that lease? Does the face rent remain intact and there's only 1 month free? Are there no months free? Are there 4 months free? Nobody really knows. I think most people believe that this is a moment in time when fundamentals are very acutely negatively impacted, but it will come back. But I don't know that anyone has said specifically, well, as soon as we get a vaccine, rents are going to go up by X.
Right. Okay. Other questions, a few of them in regards to your thoughts on the impact. I think it's both the development sites and multifamily product in regards to new climate laws and the Community Protection Act.
Okay, I think that with regard to carbon emissions and things like that, those are very, very impactful. And again, if you look at what's happened in rent-regulated product, the tremendous amount of new policy changes, regulations, rules that owners have had to deal with. You think about how profoundly it's changed from, having to abate asbestos to changing your boiler to the type of fuel you're burning, to carbon emissions, to the efficiency of water use. So many different things are changing, and that probably is a constant. And I think all of these things are being taken into consideration when new developments are planned today. I'm working with one developer that is interested in building a hotel that is COVID sensitive, and a number of different things that are being done to make that that product attractive in a post-COVID world. There are a couple of residential developers that are looking to put new technologies into buildings that they're going to be building to be sensitive to the post-COVID world. So I think it is fundamentally changing the way buildings are going to be constructed, the cost associated with operating the buildings, and you constantly have to adapt and change to a changing environment, and that's exactly what we're seeing now.
Okay, great. Another question would be the impact of the New York City budget and looming fiscal issues on assessment and taxes and ultimately property values?
Yeah, big issue. The tax system has been so inequitable for so long. And even mayors who are in their lame duck year have not wanted to take that on, which is shocking. But it's a big issue. And with the fiscal deficits we have, that's the biggest concern for a lot of people in the industry, is that tax policy is not going to react quickly to circumstances where if you have very significant reductions in rent, taxes should adjust, but they don't. I remember back to the day when in the early 90s, it used to be that properties were reassessed at 45% of their sale price, and then the new assessment was transitioned in over a 5-year period. As soon as values started to go down so much in the early 90s, the city abandoned that because tax revenue would have been going down too much. So I think the system will be changed such that tax revenue keeps going up because the city needs it so desperately. And one other point on taxes, not real estate taxes, but just taxes in general. One of the important things for our elected officials to remember is that out of the 8.5 million people who live in New York City, 65,000 people pay 53% of the taxes in town, and 1,600 pay 27%. That is very, very precarious for the city. And so we have to be very mindful of that when folks are thinking about tax policy and real estate tax policy and other taxes and the pied-à-terre tax and all these other things. We need to be mindful that we need to create a system that is balanced. I think real estate taxes are a huge issue, how that's going to play out. Already people are talking that if you go to a tax certiorari proceeding, you're contesting your taxes based on your income and expenses in January. Well, January of this year, we were pre-COVID, so it wasn't impacted. So we really have to wait until next January in order to file an objection. And it's just another one of the hurdles that real estate investors are going to have to deal with, is what is going to happen to tax policy as these properties are worked out and the distress is worked through. But tax policy is a huge issue. Everybody should be very, very aware of it and how it operates.
Great. Thank you, Bob. And again, very insightful. I'll let Amanda take it from here. Thank you.
Thank you both. Thank you both very much. Thanks, Bob, for joining us. Thanks, Bobby and Mark. And Bob, hang around if you want. We're going to move on to the multifamily panel, but it's been great to hear your perspective on everything.
Thanks again, Amanda and Bobby and Mark, and always great to be with you guys. And if there's anything I can ever do for any of you, please feel free to reach out. You know my fondness for the appraisal community. You guys are awesome, and I hope you have a great rest of the session this morning.
We'll definitely be in touch about those contracts. So,
okay, take care, everybody.
Okay, great. Right, so now we will be moving on to our central panel on the topic of the New York City multifamily market. And I wonder if we can get our slide. I'm sure there it is. And if the panelists are able to come on video, that would be great. Wonderful. Welcome. Excellent. Okay, we have everybody. Great. So I will be moderating this panel, and I'm very excited to introduce you to our 4 panelists. We'll start with Joseph Fingerman. Joe Fingerman is a managing group director and senior vice president of the commercial real estate lending group at Signature Bank, overseeing the bank's commercial real estate department. Since his start in the real estate industry almost 20 years ago, Joe has played an integral role leading a team of professionals in a variety of lending services. Joe's areas of expertise include lending on retail, office, multifamily, and mixed-use properties, note financing, and construction lending in the New York metropolitan area. During his career, Joe has been responsible for originating mortgages in excess of $7 billion over 2,000 loans. Welcome, Joe. And do you have sound? I just want to make sure that you do.
Can you hear me?
Now I can. Great.
Okay,
Welcome.
perfect.
Welcome to the panel.
Thank you, Amanda.
We also have Shibber Khan with us, founder and principal of Criterion Group. He emigrated to the US with his family in 1980, who settled in the Astoria, Long Island City neighborhood of Queens and has remained a resident ever since. He founded Criterion Group in 2002 with the launch of his first project, an 8-unit development in Astoria, and has since grown Criterion into a prolific New York City development firm, building a team of real estate experts and a portfolio of more than 2.2 million square feet. Welcome, Shibber.
Good morning, guys.
Good morning. We also have Martin Nussbaum, principal of Slate Property Group. And in this capacity, Martin oversees operations, the business platform, and investment decisions with a focus on multifamily and mixed-use properties in the city's emerging neighborhoods. Martin leads strategic repositioning, ground-up development, and conversion projects. Prior to co-founding Slate, Martin served as co-founder and managing partner of Silverstone Property Group, which purchased more than $500 million in real estate assets for repositioning and development. Welcome, Martin.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for being here. And we have Michael Tortorici, one of the founding members of Ariel Property Advisors. Serving as executive vice president in the investment sales group, Michael is responsible for originating and executing the sale of commercial real estate properties within the 5 boroughs. Over the course of his career, Michael has been involved in over 600 property sale transactions worth more than $2 billion. Welcome, Michael.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for having me.
Thank you all for joining us. And I think we may have lost Shibber Khan. Hopefully you're still there. Okay, great. Keep the video on. Great, so I'm looking forward to having a wide-ranging discussion of the multifamily market from the owner/developer role, the investor perspective, and the lender perspective. And of course, you know, as has been brought up many times so far already today, you know, one of the main topics in the multifamily market is really the dual impacts of the rent regulation laws of June 2019 and the current COVID pandemic. For appraisers, the work of parsing the impact of both of these really dramatic changes, kind of overnight changes in the multifamily market, is definitely more than a full-time job, I can say from personal experience. So I'd like to start with Joe Fingerman, and then also Michael Tortorici, since Signature Bank has a huge multifamily rent-regulated portfolio, and of course, Michael, you're actively marketing and selling these properties. But let's start with Joe. What's the big picture of how the bank's portfolio has been impacted, first by the rent law change, now by COVID? You know, we want to hear things about what are the cash flow changes in your portfolio? Are tenants paying? Are you working out deals with the landlords? Let's hear what's going on there.
Simple answer, Amanda. Everything's great. Next question. Right? All right. So, you know, obviously we're into COVID now, 6-7 months. You know, that coupled with the June landlord change in rent regulated apartments last June, well, I guess a year ago June, has certainly had an impact on our, you know, multifamily portfolio. We currently have about 16 billion of New York City multifamily, but it's really hard to paint like a, you know, one word fits all situation. It's really building by building, block by block. That's not your quote, right, Michael? It's someone else's. But what was I going to say? really depends on, what we're seeing. So right now for COVID, the big issues that we're seeing in the multifamily space are the free market or share units, where you may have Columbia University or NYU or 3 kids that are 23 years old, living in the East Village and working for Facebook. I think owners will tell you, owners I speak to that are being truthful are telling you that they can't drop the rent low enough to get people into these buildings right now. There's just, no reason if you're online to have to pay a high rent. There's concerns from a health standpoint of living with people, your social network gets bigger, your pod is getting bigger. You add in that, parts of the city have been closed up until recently, whether that's restaurants, nightlifes, museums, add in some civil unrest, and suddenly living, in mom's house in Livingston, New Jersey, or, Long Island sounds much better. And honestly, we've seen it here at Signature. When we went remote, we had employees that suddenly relocated to Florida for a month or two. So, not having to live in the city is really impacting the landlord's abilities to lease units on the free market. On the rent stabilized, well, while we expected sort of a, don't pay rent movement, we're really seeing it operator by operator. We're really seeing the better operators are able to collect better, more rents. The weaker operators are throwing their hands up and saying, well, it's COVID, I can't collect rent. But we're really only seeing, weakness with bad operators. We are seeing most of the weakness in the free market units mostly in Manhattan. And we're seeing some in select areas of Brooklyn, obviously the hipper, cooler areas, but not to any degree that we're seeing in Manhattan. And then to take it a step further, I know you're talking multifamily, but when people aren't living in the city, the bars are struggling, the restaurants are struggling. We're seeing weaknesses in fitness, food and beverage, any type of apparel. We have loans all over the place with like companies that I've never heard of, but my wife probably has heard of. And it's, that's where we're seeing the weaknesses. We still believe in New York City. We are still actively lending, obviously selectively in the city, but and we do believe that this is call it year to 18 month, cycle that we're going to be in.
What are the, you mentioned that the kind of the better operators are doing well in collections. Do you have a sense of what they're doing? Are they extending concessions? How are they, what differentiates them from the weaker operators?
I think that's probably a better question for some of the other panels like Martin, but what was I going to say? What we're seeing is their ability, their management teams are better. They don't own just 1 or 2 buildings. They're used to working with the tenants. There's personal relationships with the tenants. So we're seeing better collections on those. The one-off transactions, which we try to stay away from, what I call the one-hit wonders, we're seeing weaker, people just saying, hey, it's COVID, I can't collect rent. I'm like, well, if you try collecting rent, maybe you get some rent.
And what is the forbearance situation kind of, obviously multifamily versus mixed use?
So the initial forbearance was 3 months, and that was for anyone that was living and breathing that called in complaining that they had a problem. So those all pretty much happened May, June, July. We then went to a more systematic approach where we went through we basically asked for about 15 pieces of information. I call it the colonoscopy of second round deferrals. It's amazing that how many bars asked for the list of information and then started paying their rent, started paying their mortgage to us and didn't, ever reply to the email. So the first round was about 9 billion. Today, the second round that is ending is a little under like 2.5 billion. So we've seen dramatic increases. Unfortunately, what we're seeing now is the third round deferrals are really the headaches, right? They're really not, I'm saving money because I think things might get worse, or I'm trying to, have to shore up another property. It's like, look, Joe, the gym tenant left, 14 apartments are vacant out of 30. According to Salesforce that I'm using to track, how many people came this weekend. It was a beautiful weekend and we had 3 people tour the building. Like there's just not bodies there to see the buildings. So those are becoming, more of a workout situation. Now the bank is operating under the CARES Act, which right now, from provided that everything stays the same. It has a December 31st maturity, right? It ends. So what does that do to help us? It helps us is allegedly, and we'll see this happens when the regulators come in, gives us ability to work with borrowers without being criticized, be able to restructure loans without considering them to be troubled debt restructurings. And then there's a lot of the back of the house accounting that goes on that we can employ, for our CECL and our financial statements for the publicly traded bank that we could use by getting these things done by December 31st. So right now, we have several, basically I'm spending my day on phone calls with borrowers and our lenders saying, okay, can you at least pay interest? Can you pay interest at a reduced number? If you can't pay interest and you need more time, can you give us can we give you more forbearance, but you give us a reserve for a longer period of time? I'm trying to get that, in general out 12 to 18 months where I don't have to look at the loan, hopefully keep it current. Sadly, for all you appraisers out there, we're really trying hard not to revalue anything because I really don't think there's a market to value anything right now. It's really cash flow driven and, trying to work with the borrowers. We're getting guarantees, we're getting reserves, we're getting, all sorts of different things. We had a couple people even paid us down, which was, very exciting for us, but it's hard out there and we're here to work with the clients. Any clients, and I know I'm speaking to the appraisal community, if the clients come in and work with us and plead their case, I'm not looking to hurt anyone. We're just trying, we're trying to take what we get from the CARES Act and give it to the clients so that they can give it to their tenants.
I'll just say on behalf of the appraisers, you should give us a try. I think we can do a pretty good job of revaluing property, even in this crazy market. But thank you for that perspective. And Michael, let's hear what you're seeing, kind of from your perspective, trying to market rent-regulated property versus market rate property, different locations in the city. How are you seeing the impact of the rent law, then layered on with the impact of COVID?
Sure. So, 2019, after the rent laws, we were dealing with some of the lowest sales volume, I believe it was since 2012. So even heading into the first quarter, before COVID came about, everyone was hitting the brakes because they didn't know if universal rent control was coming down the pike. So even heading into the year, activity on the multifamily front was very slow. And now I would say that since COVID, April and May, people were just catching their breath and trying to figure out how to immediately adjust to the new reality. Then in June and July, we started getting a lot of valuation requests on multifamily and properties across the board. And then since August, we've taken out 20 new opportunities to the market, varying from multifamily, some of which we had on the market a couple of years ago that people decided not to sell at the time. Now they're showing some more flexibility in their pricing. A fair amount of affordable stuff is starting to come in, and there's definitely a demand for that type of product when we have it. But a lot of the multifamily still is not as strong of a product type as, say, commercial or small scale developments, or the type of product where people have a lot of equity, they've owned it for a long time, and they just want to get out, even small commercial properties. I was looking at some of the stats heading into here, and I believe it's something like 90% of the sales so far this year have been properties in Manhattan under $10 million, and this is for multifamily stuff, and in the outer boroughs under $5 million. So really we're dealing with very small buildings. Class 2B tax class is holding its value. That's something that's on a lot of people's radar because, as Bob was saying before, the tax burden on these buildings has climbed significantly in the last few years. A lot of buildings are now at 30% of adjusted gross income, something that was not the case a few years ago. So it's really being a burden, and that's holding people back from putting things on the market and transacting ultimately. But I think we'll have a much better sense of pricing towards the end of the year. But right now the cap rates are going up. You could see it, I think, most apparently in rent multiples, which are falling very quickly. I remember that in 08, 09, that happening as well. Seeing more properties asking 10, 11 times rent roll in areas that used to command 14, 15 times. And I think it's a trend that unfortunately will continue as people battle with vacancy and everything else.
Just in terms of how buyers are looking at multifamily properties, are they seeing the market rate units as a liability in terms of collections during COVID more or less than rent regulated units?
It depends where. Manhattan's getting hit right now the hardest. Some very nice portfolios that are run by great operators are having a lot of challenges filling those units. And as Joseph was saying, it's just hard to get those rented. The pressure has been less in Brooklyn, but I was talking to a large Brooklyn operator just the other day, and whereas they were pretty optimistic over the course of the summer, the pressure there seems to be building as well, and they're giving more concessions than they have been. They're even seeing a little bit more collections pressure. It's not as much because the people that move in Upper Manhattan are going there for more space, and when you can't go to restaurants, you can't go to museums or shows and everything, then you want to be outside. And if you're not going to the suburbs, you're going to be in areas of Brooklyn, Queens, and those areas have been holding a bit stronger. And their price points lower, so it's more valuable because people have been going there, and those areas still a lot. They can go a lot farther.
Michael, your audio is definitely breaking up a little bit and having trouble hearing you. It's a little, yeah, I'm not sure what's going on, but we will definitely get back to you. And I do want to talk to Martin and Shibber from the owner developer perspective, about some of these things. You're both heavily invested in the outer boroughs and have been involved in quite a bit of new construction and renovation projects. I'd like to hear how your portfolios have been impacted. I keep asking about market rate versus rent regulation. I'm not sure how much rent regulation you have in your portfolios. How are your portfolios performing? What's the picture in terms of concessions, rent changes? Let's start with Martin and hear about yours.
Sure. So, our portfolio is predominantly free market. So it's got to be at least 90+% free market. So I don't really have a great perspective on the ground on sort of how the rent stabilized side of the business is doing, other than just looking at new deals and so on and so forth. But our portfolio, has taken a pretty significant hit in terms of occupancy. To start, let's start with occupancy. We had a portfolio that I would say is 98 to 99% occupied going into March, and currently sits probably around 80% occupied today. So that's a significant loss in occupancy. And then separately, the rents have been reduced pretty significantly when you factor in, sort of net of concessions and all the things that we all know on this call are relevant to your revenue. We're probably down a good, best case 10, worst case 20% in general on the new leases that we're signing to replace some of the vacant apartments. I think what we are seeing is that at this point in the market, and specific to Manhattan right now, we think that the amount of demand is stalled for the time being. The supply is the supply, and it's going to increase slowly in Manhattan. It'll increase faster in Brooklyn because there's more ground up development happening there. But in Manhattan, there's not a lot of ground up development rental. So what's happened is that all of the owners that have all of this supply are fighting over very limited demand. I think for the most part, people have picked their place of residency through definitely the end of the year, and my opinion is through the spring leading into the summer at every different phase, from college age through pied-à-terre type of renters. I think everyone sort of picked their poison for the time being as to where they're going to reside and where they're going to live. So we're all sort of beating each other up to try and get that same tenancy into our building, which is just leading to a great environment for renters and a pretty rough environment for building owners. The condo market is completely stalled. We actually have a lending arm to our business that's called Scale Lending. We've lent out about $800 million over the last 12 months to 16 months, and we have a couple of condo inventory loans that we originated. So we're seeing the condo space in Manhattan, and it's very challenged right now for the same reasons that I think the multifamily side is, very honestly, and even more so because it's a more permanent decision versus a one-year lease or whatever's going on with that. And then, on the retail side, it's just an absolute bloodbath at this particular moment. So other than some of the main corporate leases that we have with a Starbucks or a Bank of America, which we have, the mom and pops are struggling, and we're working diligently with them to try to get them back alive. I mean, I don't think it makes any sense to beat them up at this period of time. I think it makes sense to partner with them, help them get back on their feet, and hopefully the good operators will sustain the business and get through it the same way we think we will. And the lesser, operators will have to go about, moving out, and we'll bring in someone better. So I think that's sort of how we see Manhattan. Brooklyn, I think to what Michael said earlier, really did a lot better. I just want to go back to collections. Our collections are at this point 95+%. We're not having issues with collections. We were having it for a short period of time in March and April, where there was like maybe, and even in March and April, it was only maybe a 10 to 15% collection issue. The bulk of the issue was just move outs. That was the bigger issue, and non-renewal. But our collections in Manhattan and outside Manhattan have been very strong for the last several months. It's just the occupancy is and the rent we're billing is the issue. So to what Michael was saying, is I think Brooklyn sustained itself pretty well March, April, May, and then something sort of took a little bit of a sharp right turn in June, July, August, where we again started to see a lot of vacancy pop up on us, whereas in March, April, May, people were staying and renewing. So we have seen an uptick in vacancy, not the same level of Manhattan, but it is leading into the concession game. It's leading into, again, sort of everyone fighting over the same tenancy. And so, I would cut the percentages essentially in half if you want to sort of make a global look at sort of what we're seeing compared to what the numbers were in Manhattan. And we're leasing, but we're leasing at lower numbers and not nearly at the velocity that we were historically. Also, I think that our portfolio was built to turn over during the peak leasing seasons. So we have the bulk of our portfolio turning over in, April, May, June, July, which in a normal period of time is fantastic. It just time-wise, this particular, because of COVID and when it hit, it landed up being sort of a double whammy. Fortunately, I think that we're going to be pretty stable for the next 6 months. So hopefully we'll catch up to some of the vacancy that we have and try to get people into the apartments. On the condo side in Brooklyn, we have continued to sell. So I think that's something to note, at maybe 10% less than what we had underwritten. And we were selling at pre-COVID, but I would say at about 50% of the velocity that we were seeing pre-COVID.
And did you have development projects that were in under construction and in lease up now?
Yeah, so I mean, we haven't stopped. So very honestly, like we just opened up a 120 unit ground up rental project in East Williamsburg that we're leasing today. As we speak, we opened up leasing no more than 2-3 weeks ago. The leasing activity has been slower, but to my surprise, we've leased a handful of apartments over the last week or two at numbers that are not too far off on the face value of what we had hoped with, but with a 2-month concession. So that concession we had anticipated 1 month is now 2 months. We are in the ground on a 200 unit building in Astoria that we will bring to market in the next 18 months. So that's, hopefully topped off in the next, 3 to 4 months. And we're breaking ground on a project in Forest Hills on Queens Boulevard, another 180,000 square foot building that's a ground up rental in the next 30 days. So, we don't think that the market is dead. We think the market is stalled for the next 12 to 18 months. And then I would anticipate, a pretty healthy recovery, in terms of demand to start. There'll be a healthy recovery, I'm hoping summer of next year. And pricing, we'll see where it lands. I think New York is a very resilient city and state, and I have a lot of confidence that it'll bounce back in time.
Great. Well, you you and Shibber Khan both have a big presence in Astoria, Long Island City, and the Queens market. And I'd like to hear from you, Shibber, about your perspective specifically on that, oversupply, potential oversupply of new construction in that market. And I think you have also pivoted perhaps away from some of that into a different sector. I'd like to hear how your portfolio is doing and how you're looking at developments.
Hi. I mean, a lot of the portfolio descriptions that Martin gave is probably true for us also. It's pretty much what we're seeing. I think the only difference that we've seen on the rental side, which has attracted more tenants, is not to play this gimmick that we play with 3 months rent and net effective rents. We just rent at the net effective rents and be done with it, you know. And my advice to all my leasing team is that keep the apartments occupied, even if you have to drop rents to wherever it is. So
how much have you dropped? I'm not sorry to interrupt, but we'd love to know how much you've dropped those rents.
We dropped rents 25 to 30%, you know. And but my biggest observation from this is that COVID has probably taught us in the real estate industry is that designing buildings by spreadsheet does have negative impacts. You know, one of the observations we saw very early on, and it continues to be true, is that people actually do want larger apartments. So the studios have been in the worst performers. The one bedrooms, small one bedrooms, the economic one bedrooms have been the second worst performers. So in order to make development models work, I think a lot of us pivoted towards smaller apartments and smaller spaces and common amenity space and everything else. And I think COVID is going to make us rethink that entire concept. So Long Island City, we're seeing that very much, is that the demand for the small apartments is almost obsolete. I mean, it's almost zero. We can't give away our studios. I mean,
are your larger apartments typically leasing or selling to families, or are they shares? Like, you know, Joe was saying he was having a lot of trouble with the demand for share type apartments.
So we're seeing family demands also, and we're seeing actually individuals or couples that would like to just have larger spaces. I mean, the fact is they can't use the common spaces, and they can't use amenities, so they just need a larger space to occupy and work. So we need to see if that trend, and I mean, the other trend that we see is between the two neighborhoods that we have multifamily space in Long Island City versus Astoria. Astoria has definitely done well. So neighborhoods that are neighborhoods tend to do well. We almost have zero vacancy in Astoria. Are the rent numbers lower? Yes, but still they get absorbed very quickly, and people are gravitating towards a neighborhood feel, which is somewhat lacking in Long Island City. So those are two observations that I have that might be slightly different from Martin's observations.
Are you still actively doing new developments in Queens, or are you buying land and looking at these kinds of opportunities? How are you looking at the supply there?
So on the long term, we're definitely bullish in Long Island City. Long Island City, we're bullish in New York in general. However, we were lucky that we sold all of our development sites for numbers that people were willing to pay us. Not numbers we demanded necessarily, but brokers and others brought to us. So we exited probably 1 million square feet of development, ground up development, and thank God we did. I'm very happy about that. And about 3 years ago, when we started to stress our spreadsheets in order to make deals work, and we were still losing out on bids, we started to look at other asset classes, and so we have segued into other asset classes. So our self-storage deals have done phenomenally well. Our self-storage deals are probably the top performer in our holdings right now. And the other asset class that most people do not affiliate with us with, but we are very heavily vested in, is an industrial asset class. And within that subsector, we are in the film studio business. And the film studios are doing phenomenally well. Even during the COVID, the reservations are holding, and we're going to expand on that portfolio. And the general studio and our parking business has probably doubled in NOI over the time. So those two businesses are very attractive to us.
And Martin and Shibber, in terms of you're the retail component, you don't have a whole lot of retail in your portfolio, or how's that doing?
I couldn't comment on that. I have, I think, 1,000 square feet of retail. So
Yeah, I mean, we have a lot of retail, so it's not performing great. Let's put it on. If it's not a supermarket, coffee shop, or some corporate backed lease that has some teeth to it, it's not a great environment right now in New York City. And I think it's of all of the asset classes that we all have been discussing, I think that retail prior to COVID had significant issues in terms of just the pricing that had retail had traded hands over the last 3 to 5 years. And I think structurally, retail, in my opinion, post-COVID will be a very different asset class than it ever was. Whereas I think all the other asset classes with time will rebound to some form of normalcy. I don't think retail comes back in the same way we all knew it in any way, very honestly. And we discuss it all the time. I think that asset class will be forever changed in a very fundamental way that is going to be interesting to watch. And it's not coming back the way that we know it.
Do you think that a kind of a repricing, obviously it's a dire situation for retail. We're seeing unprecedented, amounts of vacancy and business closures, and coming out of this, whenever that may be, do you see a silver lining in the in the repricing of retail to allow for more of the mom and pop kind of neighborhoods that, Shibber, you were saying Astoria, Queens is holding up in multifamily because it actually has, kind of that community neighborhood type retail?
Yeah, I'm not sure, very honestly, because I think, I really do believe that prior to COVID, there was a really big issue with retail that, wasn't what was only spoken about amongst the people that had to deal with the issue. But I really do think that retail in general is going to be more of a partnership type of business with landlords, like much more of an experience-based retail to support whatever's above it for the most part. I will say that the majority of our retail is less than 20% of the value of the buildings that we own, because we're much more multifamily condo based. But I think that at the end of the day, the retail is going to be something that we're going to view as an amenity to the building more so than a revenue driver for the short term. And the short term to me is 2 to 3 years. And then we're going to have to see how the retail world comes back out of this. If it's going to be much smaller spaces, if it's going to be a different hybrid business model in terms of revenue sharing, percentage interest. And I just don't think that any retailer today can be like, I can definitively pay you this much money every month, because it's, their businesses are upside down more than anyone else's.
I guess the other kind of big question from a valuation point of view, and this is really throwing this out to everybody on the panel, how are you, obviously we've heard from you all about big cash flow changes, at least in the short term. How are you thinking about cap rates? And Martin, I know you've sold at least one new construction property during COVID. Michael, you're pricing property all the time, and Joe, clearly cap rates are part of your calculus in lending. what's the change specifically, I guess, in the short term and then longer term?
So I'm gonna take this one first. I'm very optimistic about cap rates being at worst where they were pre, and in my opinion, I think they compress. We are doing a lot of financing right now in our portfolio, and a lot of that financing is no longer with Joe Fingerman type of lenders, because you have all of a sudden agency financing that has come in and has gotten super, super aggressive in New York City real estate, and at rates that I haven't seen in 15, 20 years. I'm not sure when anyone on this call has seen it, where you're able to borrow, 10-year type paper at mid twos to higher end 2% interest only. If you can put that kind of leverage on a property in New York City, and you could get positive leverage buying an asset without any value add to play, buying it at a 4 cap. And so if you properly underwrite your expenses and you take the current revenues that are in place today, in my opinion, you're buying at a pretty bottom of the market. If you feel comfortable that your rents are where they are at the bottom, which in my portfolio, I'd say about 50% of our buildings, we feel we have reached the bottom and we know what it's going to look like. There's 50% that we're still trying to figure that out. But if you know where that's going to land and you can put some long-term inexpensive paper, I think cap rates come in a little bit, 50 basis points.
And Michael, what's your, how are you looking at cap rates?
Yeah, I agree with what Martin's saying. I think short term, we're definitely looking at a bit of a spike as we figure out. First, can you hear me right now? Or
yeah, that's
okay,
great.
So I think we're going to see a bit of a spike. We are seeing it year over year. Again, Manhattan, I think right now a little bit the worst. Outer boroughs, we're kind of getting back to 2012, 2013 levels across the board in terms of cap rates. But I think a lot of that is based on the occupancy risk right now, some of the political risk, as people get more comfortable with the bottom, and as we figure out more what this new political environment's gonna look like. New York still has a ton of value to it, and I think that it'll regress fairly quickly. The other thing is that balance sheets from banks are very healthy right now compared to the last crisis. So, and we know that interest rates are going to be staying low for the foreseeable future. So that's definitely going to give a boost that I think to some extent is being underestimated right now in the current craziness.
Great. And Joe, let's hear from you. You may be on mute once again. We'll have to unmute you. I'm going to try to speak. Oh, hold on. Joe, see if you can take it off mute. There you go.
There I am. Okay. So what was the question again? Muted? I'm muted.
Cap rates.
Cap rates. So a couple things. We won't get into the political nature of Martin's comment of why he's not taking loans from Signature and able to take it from Fannie and Freddie down all of us taxpayers' dimes, but we'll leave that for another seminar. But what was I going to say? So cap rates for Signature are pretty simple. We were never lending at the 2%, 3%, 1% that Martin was buying at, or others were buying at. We won't just make Martin the, the proverbial lamb here, but we were always lending at least 2 points higher than the market. Generally, all of our loans have to have a 125 debt service coverage ratio. So for all the appraisal community, it's very simple that we could never use a 3 cap because we would never have the debt service coverage ratio. So today, one of the changes that we're trying to show our staff is that, when someone's buying a building and it's, let's just say, a 5.5 cap rate, you're probably lending 75% of that value or something to that effect. We're trying to increase cap rates a little higher than what the owners are buying at. But at the same time, we're really looking at cash flow, which is at an all-time high, right? Because as long as they're collecting rent or are occupied, by just increasing the cap rates, the debt service coverage ratios are, now north of like 135, 140 in that range. So the hard part that we're having is we're seeing loans that have to, that let's say you have a retail tenant that is vacated. How do we replace it? What's the rent? How do we get there? And that's a lot more of the analysis than what cap rate we're using. The new originations are somewhat easy. First of all, there's not much new originations. There's not much refinancing. It's actually the weirdest part since I've been at Signature. We've been on a, for 13 years I've been here, how much more deposits can we get? More deposits. The bank is flush in deposits. I wish we sort of had a real estate market that we could lend into right now, which we don't. We wouldn't be prudent for our balance sheet to do that. So we're sitting on excess deposits, but it's hard. The bank has sort of pivoted from only real estate into other lines of business just to diversify its balance sheet as well. So that's our opinion on cap rates. Again, no size fits all. We're still seeing occasional deals, and we're trying hard. It's very easy for a person to come in and look at a loan and say, all right, 12 apartments are vacant, the retail's vacant, let's throw a 6 cap rate on it and see what we get. I'm going to tell you right now, we could spend all the money on consultants, appraisals in the world. We know that loan's not going to work. So it's very hard just for us to figure out, like, where do we stabilize? Where do we become? So that's why we're leaning more towards the debt service coverage ratio.
Got it. All right, well, let's hear from Bobby. I think you must have many questions for this group from the audience.
Thank you, Amanda. Thank you, panelists. We appreciate your time. To all the folks out there who feel free to send additional comments, we've only received a handful, but a couple of those questions or one specifically for Joe. The LTV ratios for rent stabilized products typically 65 to 75%, let's say. Has that
generally 65 to 70 on commercial? We're trying to stay under 65. Something else we're doing is we're limiting cash outs right now. It's just not the time to show up here and say, I want to take my loan from 3 million to 10 million. Like, it's just, so we're trying to, be prudent. Again, at Signature, nothing is black and white. There is no written policy, but we're trying to work on that. Another thing that we're doing is getting reserves, COVID reserves, and then we're releasing them based on collections that we see in either 6 or 12 months. So just trying to get past that. In general, though, 65% or under on commercial. Right now, for us to write a retail loan, it better be a JP Morgan Chase or strong tenancy type thing. And then for, or food service, quick service, Chipotle, we just did one. And then on the multifamily, it's generally 65 to 75, somewhere in that range.
Great, thank you, Joe. A question for Michael. You mentioned the cap rate, increases. Is that an impact to value, or is that the cap rate being applied to the net operating income and the pro forma that would lead to a lower value? And then do you see sellers in the market? Shiver and Martin, are you guys sellers at cap rates that are, how would you sell at what level of cap rate is that spike that you mentioned, Michael?
So I think just a couple things. One is it's a lot of it's anecdotal, and it's hard to paint things in a broad brush because there's so few transactions taking place that even one or two skews everything to the upside or the downside. On top of that, certain buildings that might be trading at a little bit of a higher cap rate right now, maybe their paperwork with their DHCRs isn't exactly 100% bulletproof. But so that's something else that's also being heavily scrutinized. So I think that it's the cap rates I'm talking about are generally being applied to just the net operating income. In many cases, the revenues have gone up a fair amount, so that the price per square foot is a little bit stickier than other metrics. But in Manhattan, I'd say we're looking, generally speaking, in upper 4 caps, low 5 caps right now, which are levels that we haven't seen in a bit. Brooklyn has gone up far less so far. Upper Manhattan is seeing a bit of a spike. The Bronx is seeing a little bit more of a spike. But it's hard to paint these things in a broad brush. Things that are also on the affordable side, where the downside is covered for the foreseeable future, those are still going to sell at relatively low cap rates because there's only room up. And again, we're in a very low interest rate environment for a long time. You can lock in rates on those with steady cash flow for a long time.
Great, thank you, Michael. For the panel in general, any thoughts on the pending expiration of the Affordable New York program? Maybe Martin and Shiver, thoughts on will 70/30s and the 75/25 programs what do you think? Are they going to change in some way?
I would be almost shocked to see that program renewed in its form again. I mean, I think that was a very generous 421A program, or 421A replacement program, Affordable New York. And with the current politics in place, I think I would be willing, if I was betting on it, I would say there's almost 100% likelihood that we're going to a 50% affordability and much deeper affordability than the current program has.
Yeah, I don't disagree. I mean, I think it's gonna, I can't imagine it being renewed in its current format. I'm not sure sort of how it would even be renewed. I think it goes into sort of limbo for a little while until the politics works itself out. You know, but to what Michael said earlier, I mean, we've gotten heavily involved in 100% affordable housing development, as well as, frankly, homeless shelter development and ownership. And those assets are, from a cap rate perspective, have become a lot more attractive just because of the stickiness of the revenue. And, you know, I think that in light of what we're seeing politically, the potential upside in quote unquote free market, or, you know, rent stabilized units, you know, it's just not what it used to be. So I think that a lot of people are just chasing the cash flow. And again, with the leverage that's out there, it becomes an asset class that trades at a much lower cap rate than what we've seen before.
Just a follow-up question about investing in affordable housing. Are you concerned about the budget crisis in the city in that respect, in terms of the, you know, DHS contracts and the availability of even federal LIHTC? You know, I'm not sure what kind of affordable housing you're investing in.
Yeah, I mean, we're doing both. So to answer your question, yes, it's a concern. You know, obviously, as I think most of you know, they pushed off about $500 million of funding for affordable housing that was supposed to be for 2020 to 2021, and it seems like some of that's getting pushed. Ultimately, I do believe, though, that in that business specifically, it's a long-term business, and there's clearly a massive need for affordable housing and homeless shelters. So, you know, I think that there's going to be a requirement for the city to house homeless people. There is legally a requirement for the city to home every homeless person. So there needs to be an affordable way for them to do that, and that's not by renting the Edition Hotel in Times Square, right? That can't be the most affordable way for the city to run a homeless shelter. So
there's plenty of empty hotels, though. So
yeah, so
maybe that's the solution.
So you would think that real estate more appropriately located in the right areas with a lower cost to operate and to build will be a better solution for the city. And you know, all kidding aside, it is, and it's a smarter way of long-term housing for affordable and homeless. Is not a hotel. It's going to be homeless shelters and built for use of affordable housing. So, you know, I really believe that it's just a timing issue. And, you know, we have 3,500 plus units in our development pipeline of pure affordable housing, and probably a good 700, 800, you know, units of homeless shelter. And they're all, you know, in the works of being financed, and a little bit slower, and we get pushed, you know, 6 months here and there. But in the long run, it's a business that is clearly in need and is a sustainable business that's going to have to be in place.
I think we're pretty much out of time at this point. So I really appreciate all of you participating in our panel and your insights. I think we could go on. I want to hear more about the affordable housing rents that you're getting, but we'll take that. We'll leave that for the next conference.
Sounds good.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.
Have a good day. Appreciate it.
Great. Great. So moving on to the next thing, we actually are going to take attendance once again, and can we get that slide? Great. So put your name in the questions box or email it to fallconferencehelp@gmail.com. And I do want to give you a chance to take a quick break. The conference is scheduled to resume after a 5-minute break. So we will we'll resume at 10:45 a.m. And just go ahead and submit your attendance. Thanks so much. Welcome back. We're wrapping up the break. We can go to the next slide. Great. Our closing speaker today is Ethan Penner, who will be interviewed by Dan Lesser. In addition to serving on the chapter's board of directors and running LW Hospitality Advisors, Dan is also on the board of directors of Mosaic Real Estate Investors, which Ethan founded. So I'm going to turn it over to Dan to introduce Ethan Penner.
Great. Thank you, Amanda. Hello, Ethan. Thanks for joining us. Ethan, can you hear me?
Yes. Hi.
Okay, great. So indulge me for a moment. I'm gonna provide a brief introduction of your background. Ethan is a founding member and managing partner and the chief investment officer of Mosaic Real Estate Investors and its subsidiary, MREC Management. Ethan is recognized as a pioneer in the field of real estate and real estate finance with a 35-year career marked by filling voids and responding to unseen or poorly understood opportunities. Over his career, Ethan's been involved in $30 billion of mortgage originations. Most notably, he's credited with being the primary driver in the creation of the commercial mortgage-backed securities market while he was at Nomura Securities, for which he received broad recognition, including being named one of the U.S. real estate industry's 100 icons of the 20th century. In 2011, Real Estate Forum voted him one of the industry's 65 living legends in their 65th anniversary issue. Ethan currently serves as an adjunct professor at Pepperdine University School of Business and Management, and he previously held the same capacity at the University of Southern California's Marshall School of Business. And finally, Ethan is a member of the CRE Finance Council's Executive Committee of the Board of Governors. So that's the official background of Ethan. As Amanda said, I know of Ethan for 35 years, but I've had the privilege of serving on his board for a number of years now, and have gotten to know him. And I just jotted down a couple of thoughts about how I feel about Ethan. He's smart, he's well-rounded, he's very well-read and highly articulate. He's very spiritual, and he's just a good guy. So Ethan, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Dan. Those last comments are worth more than all the other accolades from the business world. So thank you very much.
Thank you. So let's start off with a little bit about you, sort of personally. Where did you grow up?
Well, I was born in the Bronx, and when I was 8, my folks were divorced, and my mom and my younger brother and I moved to the suburb of the Bronx called Yonkers, New York. I know everyone there is in New York, so you guys all know that.
And tell us about your childhood a little bit. What was it like?
Well, I mean, my neighborhood looked a lot like a lot of the blue-collar neighborhoods of Queens and Brooklyn and the Bronx and Yonkers, with, you know, just miles of 6-story red brick apartments, post-war construction, tons of kids. You know, I grew up poor, but I didn't really care or know it too much. You know, I think I learned very much in my life from my childhood, and it stays with me to this day. You know, I think that I think it's blessed when you get a journey that's rich and covers the tapestry of what a life can live. And I've been, you know, poor, and I've known and I retained friends from that socioeconomic strata, and I've been richer and rich and less rich. And, you know, I kind of had a good journey, a good full journey. And I think it allows me unique empathy to kind of understanding people in the world and what's important and what's not. So, you know, I played sports. I did what normal kids in blue collar neighborhoods do. You know, you go out when you're not in school as soon as the sun rises, and you stay out until your mother calls you home because it's too late, and play sports with your friends and talk sports all day. And that's kind of what my childhood was like. I went to yeshiva,
I was very privileged in that sense. So through ninth grade, I had an incredible education, a spiritual education, not a rote Jewish education. And I think that gave me a really good foundation that has been with me ever since.
And where did you graduate college from?
I went to New York University and graduated from there.
Okay. And then maybe just take a minute. I know I read the official party line but take us through your journey. So when you got out of school, tell us about what you ended up doing and how you got to forming Mosaic.
Sure. Well, my first job was just to get a job. You know, I graduated in 1982, and for those of you who are old enough to remember that period of time, there was a pretty bad recession with interest rates. You know, the 10-year Treasury was yielding near 16%, and the economy was contracting, and there were very few jobs. And I had a girlfriend who lived in San Diego because my dad moved out there, and she was going to college there, and I wanted to be close to her. So I moved to Southern California, and the only job I could get was at a savings and loan. I barely knew what a savings and loan was, and it was very fortuitous. You know, I think that I've learned that, you know, there's a destiny to our lives, you know, if we pay attention to it, and it carries us where we're supposed to go when we allow it to. And I've seen that in my life. And I worked for that savings loan, then I kind of stayed in the savings loan industry with another one, which introduced me to the secondary mortgage market at the very beginning of the creation of the secondary mortgage market. I went from there to Drexel back in New York and became one of the first mortgage-backed securities traders, trading credit, meaning non-agency guaranteed mortgage-backed secure mortgages. And it was an amazing job. It was probably, you know, the most incredible break that a young person could get. I was not yet 24, and I was put in charge of a business where I was committing capital to the tune of, you know, I had $1 billion balance sheet at my disposal at that young age. It was remarkable and formed the foundation of my career. So I was managing money since then. I was recruited from there to Morgan Stanley, and I built from scratch the non-agency mortgage finance and mortgage trading business at Morgan Stanley, which went on to be the biggest business when I was there, the most profitable business in fixed income, and over the succeeding 20 years, the most profitable business in the firm. And it gave me that period of time of structured mortgage finance and working with the rating agencies and the bond buyers and understanding that gave me a unique background to create the CMBS kind of solution, right? In the early 1990s, there was, for those of you who were there, it was just a time that was incredible where the entire lending industry retracted at once from the real estate lending business, and borrowers who had maturing loans had nowhere to go to refinance and were facing loss of their properties, even if they had tons of equity in it. It was a terrible time for the industry. And CMBS, or the securitization and the accessing of the bond market, seemed to me very obvious solution. But to me, it was that way because I had the background I had at Morgan Stanley in the 6 years prior to that. So I had left Morgan Stanley. I had started my own version of an opportunity fund. At the same time, Barry started Starwood, and Tom started Colony, and I started something called Magellan. We didn't really know each other, although I came to know them all very quickly because we had a similar vision. They went towards the buying of distressed assets, and I went towards the solving for the finance dilemma, just because that was my background. And I created CMBS while at Magellan, backed by Cargill. That was everyone had like their lead investor. That was my lead investor. And then that led me to being introduced to Nomura, and kind of, they say the rest is history. I created a monster industry in the process of responding to this unmet need. And I think that those words ring important to me, and I know you know that, Dan, which is the concept of meeting unmet needs. I think that when we meet unmet needs, we find fulfillment for ourselves, and we bring something of value to the world, and then we deserve to get rewarded for that. And so I've always sought to identify unmet needs within my sphere of capabilities, and then use my capabilities to help meet those unmet needs. And probably never more so than in the early 90s when I created the CMBS response. Since then, I took a bunch of years off. I lived in Hawaii. I got divorced. I got remarried. I started another family. I have 5 kids now, adopted kids, birth kids, first marriage kids, second marriage kids, all kinds of kids. And for those of you all who have kids, you know that that's the hardest, well, that and marriage are the 2 hardest jobs of all. So I work very hard daily at those jobs, and probably fail more than I succeed, but I try really hard every day. I joined CBRE in the wake of the great, kind of in the global financial crisis, because of my background in kind of the plumbing of securitization. I was able to anticipate how bad that crisis would play out and how global it would play out. And I joined CBRE. A friend of mine was CEO of it, and I started a business that was to raise capital and take advantage and respond to that dislocation, and did very well. He left, then I left, and I started Mosaic, and so that's the short story. And Mosaic's has been an amazing journey. It's been 6 years pretty much since we started the company, and we've built quite a, literally from scratch, quite a nice foundation of a company that is on the verge of doing some amazing things. And we did a few things right, and I probably would talk about some of those things in the context of valuation, because I think that an approach to real estate, I developed certain foundational beliefs, my true north, if you will, and we adhere to those things. And it's extremely gratifying when it turns out you're right. Like when you have this hypothesis about how things ought to work, and then you actually stick to them, and it turns out that you were right. It's very, very comforting and very rewarding, and that's how I feel at this particular moment in time, as we are in this unknowable and unprecedented downturn. I feel uniquely strong, I think, in an industry that doesn't feel uniquely strong, and I attribute it to the true north that I just referenced.
So give us the elevator pitch on Mosaic.
Well, it's very simple. I would say that there's 2 basic concepts. One is how do you make money? Like how do you, but it really comes down to a version of what I said before, which is meeting unmet needs. I use the words avoid competition, because if you're doing what everybody else is doing, well, you're not really doing anything to meet any unmet needs. You're not really bringing any unique value, and you're probably coming into a very crowded trade. And so if you're coming into a very crowded trade, you're probably not going to do so well when that trade has to get unwound. So I'm talking like the old trader that I was, but that never leaves you. And avoiding competition is kind of rule number 1 at Mosaic. Rule number 2 is a package of rules which kind of go under the heading, never lose anyone's money. Now, in real estate, I've learned that it's a unique asset class where if you adhere to basically a couple of rules, you could manage money in real estate by and never risk losing money. And so those are the most important things, and they together, I think, are the true north I reference. So one is only invest in what I call viable real estate, and I think this concept of viable real estate needs to permeate the appraisal and evaluation business. And I'll describe what viable means, but quite simply, it's just a place where people have always wanted to go and likely will always want to go. Okay, so it's viable. 2 is so not speculating on demand. 2, making sure that your basis is a sound basis by a historical standard, right? And I think that we tend to look at moments in time, both in valuation and also in investing. And I think it's much more appropriate to have a longer term horizon. And how does my basis look on a historical standard? And then the last most important thing, or without the others wouldn't matter, is staying power. Because we know from history that surprises occur, and every cycle there's an end to the cycle, and it's a painful end, and we cannot predict what it will be. We never would have imagined it would be a pandemic, but I think those of us who have been around with some gray hair like you and I, Dan, we knew it was coming. We just didn't know what it would look like. And
Right.
even we were surprised, because who would have ever imagined it would be this, right? But we knew it was coming, and I think that that gray hair and knowing it will be coming causes you to create a balance sheet with staying power that allows you to survive and even thrive through a downturn. I think that those who can survive thrive, right? So there's winners and losers in downturns. I actually like downturns. I mean, it sounds kind of a little bit moribund, but as a professional, it's what allows separation. As Warren Buffett said, you see who was swimming without a bathing suit when the tide goes out. And I think that's a version of what I say, which is you can see who actually knows what they're doing and who was just kind of riding the crest of the wave that everybody else was riding, which was leading towards a temporary success.
That's great. So yeah, obviously you have some deep experience over multiple cycles. What's your view of the moment? How is this moment similar or different from disruptions and downturns of the past that you've lived through and experienced?
Well, I think this is an incredibly important question that everyone needs to get their arms around, no matter what their business is, whether you're in the valuation business or you're in the investment business or whatever it is you do. This is a very important question. And I think for me, the answer is it's only similar in the sense that human beings are still made of the same basic stuff that they were made in all previous cycles going back to the beginning of time. And so what will be similar is the human reaction to the crisis. That's the only thing that will be similar. Actually, I think nothing else will be similar. So, obviously this is unique, right? There's never been a pandemic influenced economic downturn. Well, at least not in our lifetime. And the world was very different back in the early 10s and such. So it's a very historically unique situation. The world itself is in a historically unique and compromised situation, from a fiscal status to a sociological status. Our world in America, especially, because the rest of the world, who cares about it? I only say that jokingly, but obviously we've got enough problems. We don't need to talk about or worry about other people's problems. But our problems in this country going into this crisis were historic. Okay, they were massive. We were facing incredible headwinds that were disguised by interest rate policies and easy monetary policies. And thank God, by the way, for those things. Coming from a libertarian, I have a newfound appreciation for Fed and government intervention, because without that, we'd be in some form of 1929 or worse right now. I'm quite confident. You got to remember that in 1929 to the through the 30s, we had a government attitude which was, if you lost your job and you can't eat, tough shit, go to the church, see what they'll do for you. That's markedly different than what this response has been to this crisis, and really what was going on fiscally for the last decade or so, as we struggled with an adjustment from the industrial era to the technology era, and the kind of loss of jobs and dislocation that caused. So what I've seen here is that the COVID epidemic and the response to that, because it's more about the response to it than it is about the epidemic itself or the pandemic itself, has caused a rapid acceleration of the effects of the weaknesses that were already in place prior to the pandemic. And if you want to really be negative, Dan, which I hate to kind of be, but you have to be honest. I mean, I think that one of the things, my observations is in the world and in past cycles, especially we're early in the real estate world thinking about this. People want to believe in the best. So they want to ignore all negative signs and just pray for, put their head in the sand and pray that the storm passes quickly, and then when they pull their head out of the sand, things are good. I don't think that's going to be the answer here. I do think there's profound pain, and I think it's going to last for longer than shorter, meaning years, not months, the effects of that. I think it's going to cause significant losers and some surprising losers, right? You know, you have large, wealthy individuals and pockets of money that are going to lose fortunes. Again, I would say this is not because of the pandemic or even because of the response to the pandemic. It was going to happen anyway, but it was on its way in a slower motion path. This just sped it up real fast. So the demise of the Plaza District, I've been speaking about that for at least 10 or 15 years. And the reason I was is because I looked at my own sons. I have two sons now that are 29 and 32. And I know, Dan, when we were young bucks in our, let's say 18 college and, you know, 18 to 25, our dream, like if you said, okay, what's your dream? What's the dream of a kind of young, ambitious kid at that time? It was you saw yourself, if you closed your eyes, in a suit and tie walking down Park Avenue with a briefcase in your hand, going to one of those kind of majestic office buildings and doing something really important. But my kids had no such dreams, you know, like and they were highly educated and highly ambitious, but they had a different dream and a vision for themselves. And when I realized that, I was like, boy, that Plaza District's in for a hell of an adjustment, because a whole generation of kids coming up has no kind of emotional tie to that place. And as they become the leaders of tomorrow's companies, as they have and are beginning to, it doesn't bode well for the Plaza District and some of the historical places in the world that have benefited from our dreams, but are not necessarily consistent with the dreams of younger generations. This has only accelerated that.
Great. Well, tell us about your view of valuation and the role that appraisers serve at this time. How should appraisers be thinking about value and cap rates during a time of, you know, obvious uncertainty, and frankly with very, very little empirical transaction data?
You know, it's very interesting, Dan. I've never spoken to an audience of valuation professionals before, and I've spoken, I don't even know, but it's not thousands, it's hundreds of times professionally. And, you know, I think that, I don't know if everyone listening can fully appreciate how massive the impact that you all have on the movements of money in and out of things. Like there's a symbiotic relationship between the valuation professional segment of the real estate industry and the investment segment of the real estate industry, and it's a push-pull both ways. And I think that so first I want to preface my comments by saying that I take every word I say to answer this question with great care, because I think that how the people listening to these words and the people in the evaluation industry think about real estate, to a very large extent, drives capital flows, which becomes to a certain extent a self-fulfilling prophecy. You can't make black white, okay? You can't do that. You guys are not alchemists, but you can have an impact for a short period of time that could create realities over short periods of time. And I think that's very powerful. And I don't think many people fully appreciate that, both probably in your own business, in your side, the valuation side, as well as in my side, the investment side. So it's something to really be thoughtful about. So in answering your question, I mentioned this word viability, Dan. I think that viability is a word that I use all the time. You know, I do that when I think about, it's the first of the three things I mentioned that I look at when I think about not losing money. And I think that too little attention is paid to viability. So let me point to an example, a very big example in this last cycle of a mistake that I saw made over and over and over again, and it became mainstreamed, so to speak, which is what I call transitional real estate and transitional real estate finance. I pretty much avoided, and I thank God that I avoided that entire movement over the last 4 or 5 years. And I did it because of the avoid competition rule at Mosaic, which is, if everybody's doing it, what do I need to do it for, right? And it turns out that everyone was doing this. And it was because, of course, when you get late in the cycle, yields drop and people are looking to produce yields, and they go out the risk spectrum and they try to outsmart themselves or their investors or their appraisers or somebody, okay? And they go out and buy what my grandmother would call dreck. And they pretend that it's not dreck and that there's some wizardry involved in turning dreck into something that's not dreck. And they get lenders and valuation agents to kind of go along with the whole game or scheme, if you will. And that's where this industry was to a very large extent. Some of this, I would say the brightest lights in our industry on the investment side and the financing side were engaged in this game of dreck, or transitional real estate investing and finance. And, one of the things I learned, you asked me when I was a kid, I go back to when I was a kid, some of the most important real estate lessons, if you just pay attention, you saw them when you were a kid. So we all, I don't know, I grew up on a street, we all did, where there was like one site in the street that changed restaurant names seemingly every year. Like every year there was a different restaurant, and every year the restaurant went out of business. And from that, I remembered from the time I was a little kid, there are just certain sites that are not supposed to be restaurants, you know what I mean? And maybe they're not even supposed to be retail. Who knows why, right? It's just on the wrong corner, the sun hits it wrong at the wrong time, or the lighting of the street, or who knows what. There's something, but have a little humility. If like 20 restaurants in 20 years have tried and failed, probably you shouldn't be the 21st to try, right? Well, the whole transitional real estate movement flew in the face of that observation that I had. And it's like, okay, let me take failed real estate that can't seem to attract enough tenants, and let me do something else to it to try to make it attractive to tenants. And I would say that by and large, all that real estate violated the viability rule, okay? And I think valuation professionals could pay more attention to historical viability of locations, viability also looking forward, like keeping your kind of head out of the sand and saying, investment professionals too, and saying like, what does the world look like today and where is it going? And does that bring into question at all the viability of this particular location? So the Plaza District is a great example. Rock solid, right? All the institutional money in the world was clamoring to get in there, even as recently as very recent, okay? And at historically low cap rates. Well, that was supported by valuations in the end, right? But I would say, while I wouldn't throw the Plaza District in the garbage by any stretch of the imagination, I would say that because its viability changed on a look forward basis, probably 10 or 15 years ago. Look, when Google came into New York, I think it was about 15 years ago, looking for a New York headquarters, and they specifically told the brokers representing them, don't show us anything in the Plaza District. That should have tipped everybody off that maybe the Plaza District deserves a higher cap rate going forward than it did. And I think that's where things are. So viability is not only, as it is for me, an on-off switch, but it's also a nuanced switch with regards to cap rates, because as we go from highly viable to slightly less highly viable, that has to have an effect on cap rates, which is effectively the multiple at which you would apply to income. So I think viability is one area that I think, again, historical and forward-looking, that I think, and the impact it would have on cap rates, that I think the valuation industry should be thinking about more than they ever have, because I think we're in a transitional stage in the world, right? A very transitional stage in the world, and it's calling into question in an historical way viability and the issue of viability. So I would say this is the one area that I would be highly focused on the valuation side, and on the mirror of that, I am on the investment side.
Great. Tell us a little bit about the performance of Mosaic's portfolio, and particularly how are your investments faring since the COVID downturn, and maybe you could even talk about a specific case study or two.
Well, You know, one of the things that we did in going hard against the grain and hard against this whole financing of transitional real estate and being cognizant of the inflection point we have in the world, we really embrace new versus old. We believe that new construction, that the risks were greater in older existing buildings than they were by far in new construction. And so with that kind of global view, we became a financier of new construction in a significant way. And I'd say that that has worked out by and large extremely well. You know, so again, it's contrary to what people want to believe. They want to believe new construction is the riskiest thing to do in real estate. You know, again, I was hearing that all day long from investors who were investing in funds that were buying and financing direct. And I was thinking, really? You know, is that, because I always look at things, whether I'm a lender or investor, and I say, can I be happy owning this for the long term? And well, I would much rather own a building that has just been built today or will be built tomorrow in the right location where people seemingly want to move than to own something in an area where people are seemingly leaving and tenants are kind of challenging to find for the building, and the building itself is inferior physical structure from a either architectural or technological or environmental standpoint. So more than ever, I think this embracing of new construction is relevant, and I think we're on the cutting edge or the frontier of that, and I think we still are, and it's put us in a very good place. As far as specific investments, we have about 40 different investments in our portfolio, and I was kind of thinking about what can I point to as an example of something. You know, the good news is that I like talking about the things that didn't go well, because, and so let me do that. I know we have about, out of our 40 positions, I think we have 5 that are maybe 3 where we have REO and 2 where we have loans that are not performing or are defaulting right now. So maybe I'll pick one of those as 1 or 2 of those as examples, because that's another notion that I think the industry gets wrong. Defaults are disastrous for equity investors, right? So if you think about, again, let's tie it into valuations. Your typical borrower, not public company, but your typical real estate borrower is borrowing 75% of cost or 75% of value. And it could be more, by the way. You know, in bull markets like the last few years, it probably was closer with preferred equity to more than 80%. Well, let's say it's 75%. So that means that if you were an investor in a building or a fund, well, you probably lost all your money, okay? Because and that's pretty shocking, you know, but just like that, if valuations are down 25%, you've had 100% wipe out of your principal, which is obviously an unmitigated disaster. So downturns like the one we're in, and I think we'll be in for some time, are absolutely disastrous situations for borrowers. And the reason is because borrowers don't have staying power, right? So for them, they have their loan come due, or they have to make their interest payment, and they can't. They're not occupied. But for a lender who's got staying power and a good basis by historical standard, it's a home run. It's an opportunity to go from a kind of a schlub who's collecting some small interest rate to all of a sudden you're the best opportunistic investor in the world, right? Every opportunistic fund is out there trying to buy things down 25 or 30%. It's in your portfolio. It's like we're literally shooting fish in a barrel. So people don't appreciate how a smart lender can actually have built into his or her business model the best real estate opportunistic investing business in the world. You don't have to leave your own portfolio, and you have culled your own portfolio of opportunistic investing that you get the privilege of owning without a competitive auction process. So pretty much. So we like actual defaults. I mean, like, I feel bad for the borrowers on a human level, but they went into this knowing what they were doing. They're professionals, so I don't feel bad for them in that sense. And they had all the upside while I was collecting some paltry chump change interest rate for the last few years. Now let's see who's laughing, So we own a couple of wonderful multi-family development sites in infill locations, and we're going to probably build those apartment buildings ourselves, and our basis is roughly on the land 40 or 50% what the basis was that someone paid for only a couple of years ago. I feel like it's a pretty good basis, so those are examples, right? I have two of those. We have an office building, which sounds like a terrible thing, and I generally have never liked office buildings. So this is not this is a unique one. It's a low-rise office building in downtown LA. It's a complex. So it's a 280,000 square foot multi-building walk-up office complex, and it's right off of the freeway, so it's easy freeway access. And it was bought by a local operator with financing from a big fund, and they didn't do a great job of kind of as funds do. They didn't do a great job of executing on their efficiency plan and on their leasing plan, and they ran out of time because of COVID, and we took it over. And now we own this at roughly 70% of what they paid for it, and a great basis by a historical standard. And we just got a valuation that implies that even in COVID, our position is 25% lower than what the valuation in today's market would be, and I think that's probably correct. So we're going to go from a lender that was making a decent interest rate to an opportunistic investor that's going to make a fairly good significant gain, and I feel pretty good about that. So those are I think the results of kind of making some good decisions, setting ourselves up right, and following those true north things I mentioned earlier.
Great. Last question, and maybe you could just give us a high-level reaction. You're speaking to a New York-centric audience. How do you feel about New York compared to the rest of the country, major urban markets? What do you see as a couple of strengths and weaknesses of the New York market right now?
Well, I'm a New Yorker through and through. I'm a New Yorker living in LA, like many Los Angelinos, but I'm definitely a New Yorker through and through. And I feel like I know New York probably as well as I know any place. Look, I lived through the period of time prior to Mayor Giuliani, which was obviously a very bad economic time and a very bad quality of life time and a very bad valuation for real estate time. I was a young man during the crises of the early 70s, but I do remember New York going bankrupt, and as a student of finance, remember how kind of borrowing and kind of issuing their own bonds, getting out of their debt. Look, I think this. In times like this, you have to say to yourself, do you believe that the United States is going to come out of this crisis in some reasonable form of kind of greatness, if you will, to borrow from our president, that it has been in our history of the world, right? Or do you think this is the end? Do you think it's the Roman Empire has now run into its wall and it's the end of the US empire? I think that's the fundamental question. I've always, in all these crises that I've lived through, all these downturns, I've witnessed that the US is resilient. People are resilient. We have our differences, but I also know that human nature is to bury differences in times of extreme challenge, which we're going to face and we're facing. New York is where it is today because there's a cycle of human nature, and there's a period of that cycle that I would call high complacency. Okay, high complacency and taking things for granted. And when those things are lost, which is the natural result of human complacency, people then get a kind of come to Jesus moment and they make the right decisions. Whatever those right decisions are, Democrats and very liberal Democrats ushered in Rudolph Giuliani. There will be another Rudolph Giuliani. There has to be. New York, for the United States to be the United States, New York can't be the mess it's in today. New York has to be the leading city from a power standpoint in the United States. Without a proper New York, the United States won't be what it has been and what I believe it will return to be. So just like none of us could predicted what would precipitate COVID. And there's a lot of opacity in kind of trying to figure out where this is all going to lead. I think there's also that same level of uncertainty and opacity as to what the short-term future of New York's going to be. But I would say when you look past that short-term horizon, one way or another, New York is going to become the shining city to the world and the attractive city to the world that it's always been. And it will get through this time just fine. And I think that as an investor, I will look forward to the opportunities over the ensuing probably 9 to 18 months to buy New York cheaply. And I think it should be bought cheaply. I think it's in a terrible, terrible situation right now. And I think it should play out in valuation, and it will. But I think that someone that has the right balance sheet with staying power, those will be highly rewarded on betting on the medium-term future of New York. I don't even want to say long-term. I think that we're living in kind of a faster treadmill world than we've ever lived in. So long-term is, who knows what that even means anymore. I don't think there's a notion of long-term in today's world. So I would say medium-term, you get rid of your current mayor, you get the right mayor and the right commitment to the right principles of how a city and a society function, a respect for law and respect for safety, respect for property rights, and an understanding about what attracts employers. And all of a sudden, New York is rocking again, and it has to be.
Ethan, you're a scholar and a gentleman. I really appreciate you taking the time to visit with us. Do we have time for a couple of questions, Bobby, Amanda?
I think we have time for at least one question.
Okay.
So Ethan, thank you for giving us your time. A couple questions come in that are related. To paraphrase, can you give us your thoughts on viable locations and property types within the New York City market?
Well, one of the things that make, Bobby, New York special from an investor standpoint, and why it's always attracted more investors than any other city probably in the world in real estate, is that it's chock full of viable real estate. I always get asked the question, would you ever invest in XYZ city? And let's call XYZ Cincinnati or Buffalo. And I always say, well, Cincinnati or Buffalo have people too. And my ancestors come from Poland, and there's still people living in Poland. So there probably will still be people living in Cincinnati and Buffalo, hundreds of years from now too. And the difference between Cincinnati, Buffalo, and New York City is that sorting through all the locations in Cincinnati and finding the few viable ones is the trick. It's a tricky thing to do. New York, it's kind of always been a shooting fish in the barrel. There are so many viable locations in New York. I think the question in New York is a question of viability for its use, right? And then I think that there's probably a lot of expenditures involved in repositioning real estate in New York. But I think from a viability standpoint, it's a little more tricky because it's not pure. I think most of the city's viable. I think that from end to end, I think New York's basically viable. So that would be my answer to your question. I think it's just more of what's the right basis to kind of enter into in different markets and different property types. And that's a little bit tricky today, but if you had a longer term perspective and you can get in at a reasonable entry point, I think New York is a fish in a barrel type of an investment place because I think it's still mostly always viable. It doesn't look that way today, but it is.
Great, thanks.
That's a great place to wrap it up. Thank you so much for Dan, Ethan, Bobby. Thank you very much for your time and for participating in our conference. And that's a wrap for our fall conference. I'll say to all the chapter members on this webinar, please do stay tuned for emails from the chapter about upcoming programs and events. On October 27th, our chapter will be offering a half-day seminar. It's artificial intelligence, ABM, and blockchain implications for valuation. So I hope many of you will sign up for that. Thank you so much for joining us this week, and have a great rest of your day.